Shabbos. This week's portion is Parshas Kedoshim, and as is suggested in the title of the portion, the mitzvah in the portion is Kedoshim Tiyu, you shall be holy. When you start looking at some of the suggestions in this portion, we see that it's trying to tell us that we shouldn't just do things because that's what's required, that's what's necessary, that's what's din, which is justice, but rather, as Nachmanides suggests, it's telling us to go lifnim b'shurs din, go beyond the letter of the law. But even though we're calling it beyond the letter of the law, the Torah then takes these ideas, which are beyond the letter of the law, and says, this is the law. In other words, we have to give tzedakah as an example. We have to give charity. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's actually a commandment. It's a commandment to do kindness. It's a commandment not to take interest against your friend when you give him a loan. And then we look at some of the mitzvahs in this week's portion, and it seems that we're supposed to have very elevated character traits. Why? Because it says, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. It says, "Lo sisnes achicha b'luvavecha," you shouldn't hate your brother in your heart. "Lo sikom v'lo sitar," you shouldn't take revenge and you shouldn't hold a grudge. Now, seemingly, all of these things are suggesting that we have to have these character traits within us and that we're commanded to love. We're commanded not to hate. We're commanded not to hold a grudge. But when you look at the details, according to some of the commentaries, it seems that that's actually not the case. Nachmanides, for one, says, how is it possible that the Torah should command you to have a certain feeling, to love your neighbor? And therefore he says it only means that you should do acts of kindness to your neighbor as you would to yourself. You have to act in a kind way, you have to act in a loving way, but it can't command you to love. Lo sisnes achicha b'levavecha, not to hate your brother in your heart. If you look at the next verse of the Torah, it says, you should reprove, you should admonish your friend. It's saying, don't just hold it in your heart, don't just hold those feelings, tell him or her what you feel, because that way you could try to correct it. So it's not saying you should remove the hatred from your heart. It's just saying don't keep it only bottled up in your heart. Lo sikom, not to take revenge, that's an act for sure. But lo sitar, not to hold a grudge, that sounds like you shouldn't hold a grudge in your heart. But actually, again, in the Talmud they explain how do you fulfill the commandment of not holding a grudge. So if somebody asks you to borrow their car, and last week you asked to borrow their car and they said no, to take revenge is to say no. You didn't give me your car, I'm not going to lend you my car. Lo sitar, not to hold a grudge, to say, yes, you could take my car, but I'm not going to act like you who didn't lend me the car last week. So again, it's another act. And what I think the message that the Nachmanides is suggesting is that we're not telling you that it's not important to have these character traits, to love people, not to hate, not to hold a grudge in your heart. But it's saying we can't expect you to act that way because you have to. It has to somewhat come naturally. Now these mitzvahs in the Torah, these commandments of telling you to go beyond the letter of the law, hopefully that trains you to think in a certain way. It changes your heart. It changes the way you feel towards people. If you pass a poor person in the street and you give him charity, and you pass them the next day, and the next day after that you give him charity, you're training yourself to have rachmanis, to have mercy on someone. That's why it says in the halacha, it's better to give many different times a small amount of charity than one act of charity, because it's training yourself. It's hopefully creating within you that kind of personality. We're trying to emulate God. We say, Mahu rachum afa tarachum, just like God is merciful, so too shall you be merciful. Mahu chanun, just like he's gracious to others, to people, afa tachan, so too shall you be gracious to others. There's sections in the Gemara that tell us, it says, it asked the rabbi, Reb Chananya ben Akana, why did you live long? And he says he never went to bed with someone's curse on him, meaning there's two ways to explain it, but one way to explain it is he always forgave the people before he went to sleep. And then it says also another version of this is he says that I was Ma'avar Midosov. I didn't hold a grudge. Basically, I was willing to forgive people. I didn't act the way I really felt, but I tried to overcome those feelings. And just like we ask God to forgive us, even though we're sinful, we should forgive others because we're sinful. So you could take this Gemara, this section of the Gemara, and say, "Oh, it's telling you have to forgive someone." But if you look at it carefully, it's just saying, "Why did you live long?" So one explanation is God forgives you just like you forgive that person, and therefore you'll live longer. Another possible suggestion is that if you forgive people, if you don't have hate in your heart, if you're not an angry person, if you're not always, for example, jealous and hateful and feeling these terrible feelings within you, you're going to be more calm. You're going to be able to live longer. It's not going to eat you up inside. And therefore, it's healthy. Not only is it good spiritually, not only is it good for the world and for society, it's actually healthier for you. It has a benefit for everybody not to have that hate. So, when it comes to, let's say, forgiving someone, are you obligated to forgive someone? So again, if you look at certain times in the parts of the Gemara, it will say that if you don't forgive someone for something after they ask you sincerely for forgiveness, you're sinful. But there's actually, when you look carefully, there's no particular sin. We have a list of commandments in the Torah, positive commandments or negative commandments. There is no positive commandment or a negative commandment which says you have to forgive someone. If you don't forgive someone, you're a sinner. I think the Gemara is just telling us that you're sinful. You're becoming not a good person when you don't forgive. You're as I said before, you're eating yourself up, and you're having character traits which are eventually going to be harmful to you, to your friendships, to your relationships, and to society in general. So if you want to be a good person, we want to try to be someone who doesn't even hate in our heart, someone who could forgive. But to forgive someone in halacha, it says you don't forgive someone who's not regretful, who doesn't ask you for forgiveness, or he might do that. He might be doing something harmful again in the future. You only have to forgive someone when there's really a good reason to forgive. So this idea of forgiving someone who came and might have, in a terrible situation, killed your family member, and you say, no, there's an idea we should just forgive. I don't think that that's the case. I think that we have to remember it, and the idea of we don't forget. We don't want to forget those atrocities that happened to us as a human, as a person, as an individual, as even the Jewish people, because it's important to forgive people who don't ask forgiveness, to forgive people who still hold that animosity towards you, who will do other violent acts, or will steal from you, or even just insult you. You're not really benefiting anybody. So of course you want to. There's two ideas of forgiveness. There's almost a formal forgiveness, which maybe you shouldn't give, but you don't want that to destroy you inside. You don't want to be that hateful person because it doesn't benefit you. And here's where humility, I think, just plays an important role. If you're truly humble, if you truly think of yourself as not driven by your own ego, but trying to feel that you're part of you're a more important part of society, that you just give and you don't necessarily have to take, then it shouldn't bother you. You don't have those expectations from people that they're always going to treat you well, and therefore it's not something that it's hurting you because you don't feel yourself as so important that your toe can't be stepped on, or you can't be insulted. The insult could just fly right off you, and that's not an easy thing to ask of someone, but it's something that I think we should try to reach as an ideal, and hopefully that's something that we all really get to. And as society as a whole, we have to try. Our goal, of course, is to remove hatred. Our goal is to create that love for a fellow human being. But the Torah and Jewish law and tradition understands that it's not always that easy. We understand when you can't, but you even then, as we said before, you still have to act in love to your neighbor. Even if you don't feel it, it's important to train yourself in that fashion. And if we all try to train ourselves and constantly remind ourselves of the value of loving and not hating, hopefully society and the world at large will become a better place to live. Good shocks.